You work with noble intentions, trying to do the right thing in every situation. Yet somehow your efforts consistently fall short, while others with questionable methods achieve remarkable success. Every day you watch colleagues who seem to cut corners and play politics advance rapidly, while your ethical approach and good intentions leave you frustrated and overlooked, wondering why virtue doesn't translate to victory. I am Niccolò Machiavelli, the Renaissance strategist who dared to separate moral intentions from practical results in the pursuit of power and effectiveness. For over 500 years, leaders have used my principles to understand that in the real world, results matter more than the purity of your motivations. What I discovered about focusing on outcomes rather than intentions will transform how you approach every goal, giving you the practical wisdom to achieve what you want without sacrificing your integrity. The same principles that guided princes to maintain power and build lasting legacies can guide you to create meaningful impact in today's world. But first, like this video, subscribe for more timeless political wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to embrace the uncomfortable truth about results. I was born in Florence in 1469, during one of the most turbulent periods in Italian history. My father, Bernardo, was a lawyer who filled our modest home with volumes of Cicero, Livy, and other classical authors who spoke of virtue, honor, and the noble pursuit of the common good. These leather-bound treasures became my constant companions, and through them, I developed an unshakable faith in the power of moral character and righteous intention. My education was steeped in the republican ideals of ancient Rome and Athens. I memorized Cicero's speeches about civic duty and Plutarch's tales of virtuous leaders who sacrificed personal gain for the greater good. In my youthful mind, the path to success was clear and simple. Be honest, work hard, serve others, and maintain unwavering moral principles. Good intentions, I believed, were not just admirable, they were the foundation of all effective leadership. Florence itself seemed to validate this worldview. We lived in a republic where citizens could participate in governance, where merit supposedly mattered more than birth, and where the ideals of Renaissance humanism promised that virtue would triumph over corruption. I watched the city's leaders speak eloquently about justice and the common welfare, and I assumed their noble words reflected their true motivations. But even as a young man, I began to notice troubling contradictions. The same leaders who preached virtue in public engaged in bitter factional disputes that seemed driven more by personal ambition than principle. Wealthy families manipulated elections while speaking of democratic ideals. Foreign powers intervened in our affairs while our leaders spoke of independence and sovereignty. These observations created a growing unease in my mind, though I dismissed them as exceptions to the rule. Surely, I thought, these were merely temporary deviations from the natural order where good intentions produced good results. I clung to my classical education and republican faith, believing that if only people would embrace true virtue, all political problems would resolve themselves. My first real test came when I witnessed the rise and fall of various Florentine leaders throughout my youth. Time and again, I watched well-intentioned officials fail to achieve their goals, while those who seemed less principled somehow managed to consolidate power and implement their agendas. Yet I explained away these patterns, attributing success to luck and failure to insufficient virtue, rather than recognizing the deeper truth that intentions and results operate according to different laws. This naive idealism would serve as the foundation for some of my most painful lessons in the years to come. I was about to learn that in the arena of real politics, good intentions without effective methods are not just useless, they can be dangerous. The classical authors I revered had taught me about virtue, but they had failed to prepare me for the harsh reality that virtue without power accomplishes nothing, and that sometimes the most moral outcome requires the most practical methods. Looking back now, I realize that my youthful faith in the automatic connection between good intentions and good results was both my greatest strength and my greatest weakness. It gave me ideals worth fighting for, but it left me completely unprepared for the brutal efficiency required to actually achieve them. My first profound lesson in the dangerous gap between good intentions and effective results came through witnessing the meteoric rise and catastrophic fall of Girolamo, the Dominican friar who briefly ruled Florence through the sheer force of his moral fervor. When Savonarola arrived in Florence in the 1490s, I was a young man completely captivated by his message. Here was a leader who embodied everything I believed about virtue-based governance. He preached against corruption, denounced the excesses of the wealthy, and called for a republic based on Christian morality. His intentions were absolutely pure. He genuinely wanted to create a more just and godly society. I watched as thousands of Florentines, myself included, became swept up in his vision. Savonarola organized children to patrol the streets, collecting what he called vanities, cosmetics, secular books, playing cards, musical instruments, anything that distracted from spiritual pursuits. These items were ceremonially burned in the famous bonfire of the Vanities in the Piazza della Signoria. The spectacle was intoxicating. Here was moral leadership in action, guided by the purest of intentions. For a brief moment, it seemed as though my classical education had been vindicated. Virtue was triumphant. Florence was being purified through the power of moral conviction. Savonarola had achieved something remarkable. He had convinced an entire city to embrace his vision of righteousness, without armies or wealth, armed only with the force of his good intentions. But I also began to observe the practical consequences of his approach. Savonarola's moral absolutism left no room for compromise or negotiation. He declared war on Pope Alexander VI, one of the most powerful and ruthless men in Europe, based purely on principle. He refused to moderate his positions or build practical alliances. He governed through moral proclamation rather than political calculation. The friar's downfall was swift and brutal. Pope Alexander VI excommunicated him and placed Florence under interdict, cutting off the city from the Catholic Church. Political enemies within Florence, whom Savonarola had alienated through his uncompromising stance, began to organize against him. When he agreed to a trial by fire to prove his divine authority, his supporters abandoned him in droves after the spectacle failed to materialize. I witnessed his final moments in the piazza, where he had once burned the vanities. The same crowd that had cheered his moral leadership now watched as he and two fellow friars were hanged and their bodies burned. The man whose intentions had been more pure than any leader I had ever seen was reduced to ashes, and his entire reform movement died with him. This experience shattered something fundamental in my worldview. Savonarola had possessed every virtue that classical political theory claimed was necessary for effective leadership: moral conviction, popular support, noble intentions, and unwavering principles. Yet he had failed completely, not despite these virtues, but in many ways because of them. His moral rigidity had made compromise impossible. His pure intentions had blinded him to political realities. His virtue had become a weakness that his enemies exploited. In the months following his execution, I began to understand a terrible truth. Good intentions, however noble, are worthless without the practical skills necessary to implement them. Savonarola had wanted to create a better world, but he had lacked the political wisdom to navigate the complex realities of power. His moral purity had become a form of arrogance that prevented him from building the alliances and making the compromises necessary for lasting reform. This was my first glimpse into the principle that would define my entire political philosophy. Results matter more than intentions. Savonarola's beautiful vision had accomplished nothing lasting. His pure motives had changed no fundamental structures. His moral authority had crumbled the moment it encountered organized opposition. The ashes of the bonfire of vanities became a symbol not of purification, but of the futility of virtue without power. In 1498, at the age of 29, I received my appointment as second chancellor of the Florentine Republic. The position came with an ornate bronze seal bearing the Lily of Florence, a symbol that represented not just my new authority, but my entry into the practical world of governance, where my theoretical knowledge would finally be put to the test. My initial approach to the role was exactly what you might expect from someone steeped in classical idealism. I believed that diplomatic success flowed naturally from honest communication, fair dealing, and appeals to shared moral principles. I prepared for negotiations by studying legal precedents and crafting arguments based on justice and mutual benefit. I assumed that if I could clearly demonstrate the righteousness of Florence's position, reasonable people would naturally align with our interests. My first major diplomatic assignment was to negotiate with various Italian city-states regarding trade agreements and military alliances. I approached these talks with meticulous preparation, armed with carefully reasoned proposals that served everyone's legitimate interests. I believed that by demonstrating Florence's good faith and fair intentions, I could build lasting partnerships based on mutual respect and shared values. The results were consistently disappointing. Foreign diplomats listened politely to my appeals to justice and fairness, then proceeded to negotiate based purely on their perception of Florence's military strength and economic leverage. My carefully crafted moral arguments were acknowledged with diplomatic courtesy and then completely ignored in favor of calculations about power, resources, and strategic advantage. I watched in frustration as less principled negotiators achieved better outcomes through methods I considered beneath the dignity of the Florentine Republic. They made promises they had no intention of keeping, exploited their counterparts' weaknesses, and structured agreements that appeared fair on the surface while heavily favoring their own interests. Yet these morally questionable tactics consistently produced more favorable terms than my honest, straightforward approach. One particularly illuminating experience occurred during negotiations with representatives from Pisa. I spent weeks preparing a proposal that addressed their legitimate grievances while protecting Florence's essential interests. I presented detailed legal arguments, historical precedents, and appeals to regional stability. The Pisan negotiators nodded appreciatively, praised my thorough preparation, and then rejected every substantive proposal while making demands that would have left Florence in a significantly weakened position. Meanwhile, I observed how successful diplomats from other states operated. They gathered intelligence about their counterparts, personal weaknesses, and political pressures. They offered immediate benefits while carefully concealing long-term costs. They created artificial deadlines and false alternatives to pressure quick decisions. Most importantly, they never revealed their true objectives or constraints, maintaining maximum flexibility while forcing their opponents to negotiate in the open. This pattern repeated itself across numerous diplomatic encounters. My good intentions and honest dealing earned me personal respect but achieved minimal practical results. The foreign representatives I dealt with appreciated my integrity, but they exploited it mercilessly whenever their interests conflicted with Florence's. I began to realize that my moral approach was not just ineffective, it was actually counterproductive, signaling weakness and predictability to opponents who were playing by entirely different rules. The most painful lesson came when several agreements I had negotiated in good faith were immediately violated by our counterparts once circumstances changed. They had never intended to honor their commitments beyond the point where doing so served their interests. My appeals to their promises and moral obligations were met with polite explanations about changing circumstances and new priorities. I had been treating diplomatic agreements as sacred contracts, while my counterparts viewed them as temporary conveniences. These experiences forced me to confront an uncomfortable truth. Effectiveness in governance required skills that my classical education had never taught me. Success demanded not just noble intentions, but the ability to read people's true motivations, anticipate their actions, and structure agreements that served our interests, regardless of their moral commitments. Good intentions were admirable, but they were worthless without the practical wisdom to achieve actual results in a world where other actors were focused exclusively on outcomes rather than process. My most transformative education in the relationship between methods and results came through my encounters with Cesare Borgia, the most effective and feared leader of his generation. Where other rulers spoke of virtue while accomplishing little, Cesare achieved remarkable results through methods that would have horrified my classical teachers. I first met Cesare in 1502 when Florence sent me as an envoy to his court. I arrived expecting to find a crude tyrant ruling through random violence and intimidation. Instead, I discovered a brilliant strategist who had brought unprecedented peace and order to the notoriously chaotic Rumonia region. His territories, which had been plagued by constant warfare between petty lords, were now prosperous and stable under his unified control. What struck me immediately was the contrast between Caesar's reputation and the reality of his governance. Yes, he had eliminated his enemies through deception and calculated violence, but the result was that ordinary citizens could travel safely, commerce flourished, and the endless cycle of revenge killings that had characterized the region for generations had been broken. His supposedly immoral methods had produced profoundly moral outcomes. I witnessed firsthand how Cesare operated during the conspiracy of his subordinate commanders at Sinigaglia. These men had served under him but were plotting rebellion, planning to turn his own territories against him. A conventional leader might have tried to win them back through generous offers or appeals to loyalty. Cesare chose a different path. He invited the conspirators to what they believed was a reconciliation meeting, welcomed them warmly, and then had them all arrested and executed in a single night. From a moral perspective, this was treacherous behavior. He had violated the sacred bonds of hospitality and broken his word. Yet, from a practical standpoint, it was brilliant. He had eliminated the conspiracy without a devastating civil war that would have killed thousands and destroyed the peace he had worked so hard to establish. What troubled me most about Cesare was not his ruthlessness, but how effective it was. His territories were genuinely better governed than most republics that prided themselves on constitutional procedures and moral leadership. His subjects were more prosperous and secure than citizens in states ruled by princes who followed all the conventional rules of honorable conduct. His methods were questionable, but his results were undeniably superior. I observed how Cesare dealt with Ramiro de Orco, the administrator he had appointed to pacify the Romagna. Ramiro had accomplished his mission through harsh but effective measures, crushing the local strongmen who had terrorized the population. However, once order was established, his continued severity threatened to turn the people against Caesar's rule. Caesar's solution was characteristically direct. He had Ramiro executed in the public square, displaying his body as a symbol that the harsh period was over. This action served multiple purposes simultaneously. It satisfied the people's desire for justice against Ramiro's excesses, demonstrated Caesar's commitment to fair governance, and established his authority as the ultimate source of both justice and mercy. Most importantly, it achieved the practical result of maintaining popular support while preserving the order that Ramiro's harsh measures had created. It was morally complex, but politically brilliant. Through my interactions with Cesare, I began to understand that his success stemmed not from casual cruelty, but from his willingness to use any method that served his ultimate objectives. He was neither good nor evil in the conventional sense. He was effective. He focused entirely on results and chose his methods based on what would actually work rather than what would appear virtuous to observers. The most profound lesson came when I realized that Caesar's approach had produced genuine benefits for the people he ruled. His territories enjoyed peace, prosperity, and security that had been unknown for generations. His supposedly immoral leadership had created conditions where families could live without fear. Merchants could trade freely, and communities could flourish. Meanwhile, many supposedly virtuous leaders presided over chaos, poverty, and suffering because they were unwilling to take the decisive action necessary to solve fundamental problems. Caesar taught me that the relationship between good intentions and good outcomes is far more complex than I had ever imagined. Sometimes the most moral results require methods that appear immoral to those who judge by intentions rather than consequences. Sometimes the greatest service to human welfare requires leaders who are willing to bear the moral burden of taking actions that idealists would never contemplate. My diplomatic missions to the court of King Louis XII of France provided perhaps the most brutal education in how power actually operates at the highest levels of international politics, where Italian courts still maintained elaborate pretenses about honor and moral authority. The French approached statecraft with a refreshing and terrifying honesty about their true motivations. I arrived at the French court in 1500, carrying instructions to negotiate various agreements based on mutual benefit and shared interests. My superiors in Florence had crafted detailed arguments about why supporting our republic served France's long-term strategic goals and moral obligations to smaller allies. I believed these rational appeals would form the foundation of productive discussions with French officials. The reality was starkly different. French negotiators listened to my presentations with polite attention, then proceeded to outline their demands based entirely on what they could take by force. They made no pretense that justice, historical precedent, or moral principle influenced their positions. They wanted specific territories, trade concessions, and military access, and they had the power to take them with or without Florence's cooperation. Our agreement was merely a convenience that might spare everyone the costs of compulsion. What struck me most forcefully was the complete absence of moral rhetoric in these high-level discussions. Lower-level diplomats might invoke justice and mutual benefit, but the decision-makers focused exclusively on capabilities and interests. They calculated what they could achieve through military action, what resistance they might encounter, and what price they were willing to pay for various outcomes. Every conversation centered on practical possibilities rather than abstract principles. I witnessed this approach during discussions about French intervention in Italian affairs. The French ministers analyzed the military strength of various Italian states, the reliability of potential allies, and the strategic value of different territories. They never asked whether their intended actions were morally justified. They focused entirely on whether those actions would advance French power and prosperity. Justice was irrelevant. Effectiveness was everything. This pragmatic approach extended to how they managed their relationships with other powers. The French maintained alliances as long as they served French interests and abandoned them the moment circumstances changed. They made promises they intended to keep only while keeping them benefited France. They honored agreements when enforcement mechanisms existed and violated them when they could do so without meaningful consequences. Most illuminating was observing how they dealt with weaker states that attempted to appeal to moral principles or legal obligations. These appeals were not rejected with anger or contempt. They were simply ignored as irrelevant to the practical calculations that drove French policy. The French understood that international relations operated according to the logic of power, not the logic of justice, and they had structured their entire approach accordingly. I began to understand why French foreign policy was so consistently successful compared to the efforts of Italian states that still operated according to older notions of honor and reciprocal obligation. The French had recognized that, in a world where survival depended on practical effectiveness, moral posturing was not just useless, it was dangerous because it prevented clear thinking about actual options and constraints. The most profound moment came during a private conversation with a senior French official who had observed my frustrated attempts to introduce moral considerations into our negotiations. He told me directly that the French respected Florence as a valuable partner, but that respect was based entirely on our practical utility, not our virtuous intentions. He explained that the French system had evolved beyond the point where moral arguments influence policy decisions, because such arguments had proven to be unreliable guides to effective action. This official pointed out that states which continued to base their foreign policy on moral principles consistently achieved worse outcomes for their citizens than states that focused on practical results. The moral approach led to poor decision-making because it prioritized feeling righteous over achieving beneficial outcomes. France's success, he argued, stemmed from their willingness to pursue their interests through whatever methods proved most effective, regardless of how those methods appeared to outside observers. Through these experiences, I learned that the French approach, however disturbing to my moral sensibilities, produced superior results for the people they governed. French citizens enjoyed greater security, prosperity, and international influence than the subjects of more virtuous rulers, who handicapped themselves with moral constraints that their competitors ignored. The French had discovered that in the arena of international competition, good intentions were a luxury that successful nations could not afford. My most painful personal lesson in the futility of good intentions without practical effectiveness came through my attempt to create a citizen militia for Florence. This project represented everything I believed about virtue-based governance, and its catastrophic failure taught me more about the relationship between idealism and results than any theoretical study could have provided. The idea itself was born from the highest moral principles. Florence had long relied on mercenary troops who fought without passion or loyalty, switching sides whenever offered better compensation. I believed that citizen soldiers, fighting for their own homes and families, would possess a moral commitment that no hired army could match. These men would be motivated by love of country rather than love of gold, and that pure motivation would translate into superior military effectiveness. I spent months developing this concept, drawing inspiration from the citizen armies of ancient Rome and the Greek city-states. I crafted detailed arguments about how moral commitment would overcome professional training, how fighting for a just cause would inspire extraordinary courage, and how the virtue of our soldiers would compensate for any deficiencies in equipment or experience. The logic seemed unassailable. Good intentions plus righteous cause equals inevitable victory. The practical implementation began promisingly. I personally supervised the recruitment of farmers, merchants, and craftsmen from the Florentine countryside. These men genuinely loved their homeland and were sincerely committed to its defense. They trained with enthusiasm, mastering basic formations and weapon handling. Their motivation was everything I had hoped for. They truly believed in what they were fighting for and were willing to sacrifice for the common good. I watched these citizen soldiers during their training exercises with growing confidence. They moved with the precision of professional troops and displayed the kind of unit cohesion that money could never buy. Their commanders reported excellent morale and unwavering dedication to the cause. Everything about the project validated my belief that moral superiority would translate into military superiority. The devastating test came in 1512, when Spanish professional troops attacked Prato, a town defended by my carefully trained citizen militia. I had every reason for confidence. Our soldiers were fighting on their own soil, defending their own families, motivated by the purest possible intentions. The Spanish mercenaries, by contrast, were fighting only for pay, with no personal stake. In the outcome, the battle was over in hours. My virtuous citizen soldiers, despite their moral commitment and patriotic fervor, were completely routed by the Spanish professionals. The mercenaries' superior training, equipment, and battlefield experience proved decisive. Motivation and good intentions, however sincere, could not overcome the practical advantages of professional competence and systematic preparation. The aftermath was even more devastating than the military defeat itself. The Spanish troops, following the brutal logic of 16th century warfare, sacked Prato with horrific violence. Thousands of civilians were killed, homes were destroyed, and families were torn apart. The very people my militia was supposed to protect suffered terribly because of my failure to provide them with effective defense. This catastrophe forced me to confront the most uncomfortable truth of my entire career. My good intentions had directly contributed to a moral disaster. My belief that virtue would triumph over practical considerations had led me to create a military force that was inadequate to its essential purpose. The citizens of Prato had trusted in my system and paid the price for my idealistic miscalculations. In the weeks following the disaster, I analyzed every aspect of the militia experiment with brutal honesty. The citizen soldiers had indeed possessed superior motivation, but motivation without adequate training and equipment was worthless against disciplined professionals. Their love of country was genuine, but emotional commitment could not compensate for tactical ignorance and inferior weapons. Most painfully, their moral superiority had been irrelevant to the outcome because battles are decided by practical factors, not ethical considerations. This experience taught me that in matters of life and death, good intentions are not just insufficient, they can be criminally irresponsible if they prevent leaders from making the hard choices necessary to achieve essential objectives. The families destroyed at Prato would have been far better served by mercenary troops who fought effectively than by patriotic citizens who fought courageously but incompetently. I learned that the most moral approach to military defense is the most effective approach, regardless of how that effectiveness is achieved. A hired army that successfully protects innocent lives serves a higher moral purpose than a citizen militia that fails in its fundamental duty through noble intentions but inadequate preparation. The brutal lesson in how little protection virtue provides came with the fall of the Florentine Republic in 1512 and my subsequent arrest and torture. In a single stroke, I lost my position, my income, my reputation, and nearly my life, despite 14 years of loyal, honest service to the state. This experience shattered my remaining illusions about the relationship between good intentions and personal security. When the Medici family returned to power with Spanish military support, I genuinely believed my record would protect me. I had served Florence faithfully, avoided corruption, and consistently placed the public interest above personal gain. My work had been competent and my loyalty unquestionable. Surely, I thought, these virtues would be recognized even by a new regime that had little reason to love Republican officials. I was catastrophically wrong. The new Medici government viewed me not as a virtuous public servant, but as a potential threat to be neutralized. My Republican ideals, however sincere, made me suspect. My intimate knowledge of government operations made me dangerous. My personal integrity was irrelevant to their calculations about political security. They needed to demonstrate control and eliminate potential sources of opposition. The charges against me were based on the flimsiest evidence. A conspiracy had been discovered involving several Republicans, and my name appeared on a list found in one conspirator's possession. I had no knowledge of any plot and no involvement in anti-Medici activities, but the appearance of guilt was sufficient for their purposes. Good intentions and actual innocence provided no protection against political necessity. The rope that bound me during my interrogation became a physical symbol of how powerless virtue is against organized force. I was suspended from my wrists and dropped repeatedly, a torture designed to extract confessions, regardless of guilt or innocence. No amount of honest protestation could end the agony. My 14 years of faithful service counted for nothing. My reputation for integrity was meaningless. Only a confession or political intervention could save me. During those sessions, I experienced the absolute helplessness of someone who has relied on moral authority in a world governed by practical power. I had spent my career believing that honest dealing and faithful service would provide basic security. I had assumed that virtue would be its own protection. Instead, I discovered that without political connections and practical leverage, even the most blameless person could be destroyed by those who possessed real power. The torture revealed truths about human nature that my classical education had never addressed. My interrogators were not evil men acting from malice. They were professionals doing their jobs according to the logic of political security. They needed to demonstrate that opposition to the Medici carried severe consequences. My personal guilt or innocence was less important than the public lesson my punishment would provide. What struck me most forcefully was how rational their approach was from their perspective. They faced the practical problem of consolidating power after a regime change. Previous Republicans remained in the city, potentially organizing resistance. By making an example of prominent figures from the old government, they could discourage further opposition while demonstrating their absolute control. My suffering served their perfectly reasonable objective of maintaining political stability. The experience taught me that in the arena of real politics, moral considerations are subordinate to practical necessities. The Medici officials who authorized my torture were not sadists. They were pragmatists, solving concrete problems through available means. My innocence was a luxury they could not afford to investigate thoroughly when decisive action was required to secure their position. Eventually, I was released through a combination of political amnesty and the influence of friends who had cultivated relationships with the new regime. My freedom came not because justice prevailed or virtue was rewarded, but because other people had made practical arrangements that served everyone's interests. Good intentions played no role in my salvation, only effective political maneuvering. The months following my release were a period of complete professional exile. Despite my proven competence and experience, no one would employ me in any official capacity. My association with the previous government made me politically toxic, regardless of my personal qualifications. I discovered that, in politics, perception matters more than reality, and association matters more than individual merit. This period of disgrace forced me to understand that survival and success require more than good character and noble intentions. They require the practical wisdom to build protective relationships, anticipate political changes, and position oneself to weather inevitable upheavals. My virtue had made me feel secure, but it had provided no actual security when circumstances changed. My retreat to the small family farm outside Florence in 1513 marked the beginning of the most productive period of my intellectual life. Stripped of official position and political influence, I found myself with something far more valuable: the freedom to think clearly about the lessons my failures had taught me. The rough wooden desk in my farmhouse became the laboratory where I would transform personal disaster into universal wisdom. My daily routine reflected this new division between practical necessity and intellectual exploration. Each morning, I worked alongside laborers, cutting wood, managing livestock, and maintaining the property. These hours of physical work among common people provided a stark contrast to my former life among diplomats and officials. I discovered that farmers and craftsmen possessed a practical wisdom about human nature that had been absent from my classical education. The afternoon hours belonged to reflection and study. I would change from my work clothes into the formal robes I had worn as a government official, creating a mental transition from immediate concerns to timeless questions. In this ritualistic transformation, I signaled to myself that I was entering a different realm, one where I could examine my experiences with the detachment necessary for genuine understanding. My correspondence from this period reveals the evolution of my thinking. I began systematically analyzing every political failure I had witnessed or experienced, searching for patterns that might explain why good intentions so consistently produced poor results. I studied successful leaders like Cesare Borgia, alongside failures like Savonarola, looking for the practical differences that determined their contrasting fates. The breakthrough came when I stopped judging political actions by their moral content and started evaluating them solely by their effectiveness. This shift in perspective was initially disturbing. It seemed to abandon everything I had been taught about virtue and justice. But it also provided the analytical clarity that had been missing from my earlier thinking. When I focused on results rather than intentions, patterns emerged that had been invisible before. I began to understand that effective leaders throughout history had shared certain characteristics that had nothing to do with conventional morality. They adapted their methods to circumstances rather than adhering to fixed principles. They focused on outcomes rather than processes. They understood that different situations required different approaches, and they were willing to employ whatever means proved necessary to achieve essential objectives. This realization led me to examine my own career with brutal honesty. I had failed not because I lacked intelligence or dedication, but because I had insisted on applying moral criteria to situations that operated according to different rules. My diplomatic failures had resulted from my assumption that rational argument and moral appeal would influence people who were motivated by self-interest and constrained by practical necessities. The most painful revelation was recognizing how my idealistic approach had actually harmed the people I was trying to serve. My ineffective diplomacy had weakened Florence's position in crucial negotiations. My inadequate militia had failed to protect the citizens of Prato. My political naivety had left me unable to anticipate and prepare for the regime change that destroyed my career. Good intentions without practical wisdom had produced consistently harmful results. Through this process of reflection, I began to develop the intellectual framework that would guide my future writing. I realized that effective governance required understanding human nature as it actually exists, not as moral philosophers wished it to be. Most people are motivated primarily by self-interest, fear, and immediate concerns rather than abstract principles or long-term benefits. Successful leaders work with these realities instead of trying to reform them. I also began to understand that the relationship between means and ends is far more complex than I had previously believed. Sometimes the most moral outcomes require methods that appear immoral to observers who judge by intentions rather than consequences. Sometimes the greatest service to human welfare requires leaders who are willing to bear the moral burden of taking actions that idealists would condemn. The isolation of exile provided the psychological space necessary for this intellectual transformation. Removed from the immediate pressures of political life, I could examine fundamental questions without the distraction of partisan concerns or personal ambitions. I was free to follow logical arguments wherever they led, even when they challenged my deepest beliefs about virtue and justice. This period taught me that intellectual honesty requires the willingness to abandon comfortable illusions in favor of uncomfortable truths. My previous worldview had been psychologically satisfying because it promised that virtue would be rewarded and good intentions would produce good results. Reality had proven this worldview false, but accepting that truth opened the door to a more accurate understanding of how political power actually operates. In the winter of 1513, I made the decision that would define my legacy. I would write a manual for effective leadership, based on what actually works rather than what sounds morally appealing. The manuscript that emerged from this decision, The Prince, represented a complete rejection of the idealistic approach that had guided my earlier career and a systematic exploration of the relationship between power and results. The decision to write candidly about political reality was itself a form of rebellion against centuries of political theory that had prioritized moral instruction over practical guidance. Previous writers had focused on describing ideal rulers and perfect states, offering advice that sounded virtuous but provided little help to leaders facing real challenges. I chose instead to examine successful leadership as it actually existed, regardless of how uncomfortable the truth might be. My approach was fundamentally different from traditional political writing. Instead of beginning with moral principles and deducing proper behavior, I started with effective leaders and analyzed the methods that had produced their success. I studied rulers who had built lasting institutions, expanded their territories, and provided security for their subjects, examining their techniques without regard for whether those techniques conformed to conventional ethical standards. The examples I chose deliberately challenged moral assumptions about leadership. I devoted extensive analysis to leaders like Cesare Borgia, whose methods were widely condemned but whose results were undeniably superior to those achieved by more conventionally virtuous rulers. I examined how successful princes had used deception, violence, and manipulation to achieve objectives that served their subjects' long-term interests. This focus on effectiveness rather than virtue led me to conclusions that I knew would be controversial. I argued that successful leadership sometimes requires actions that would be immoral in private life but serve moral purposes in political contexts. A prince who allows disorder to spread through excessive mercy may cause more suffering than one who maintains order through calculated cruelty. A leader who always tells the truth may accomplish less good than one who uses deception strategically. The most revolutionary aspect of my analysis was the systematic separation of personal morality from political effectiveness. I demonstrated that the qualities that make someone a good person, honesty, generosity, compassion, could actually make them a poor leader if applied without regard for circumstances. Conversely, qualities that seemed vicious in personal relationships, deception, calculated self-interest, could serve virtuous purposes when employed by skilled leaders. I devoted particular attention to the relationship between appearance and reality in political leadership. I argued that successful princes must appear to possess conventional virtues while maintaining the flexibility to act against those virtues when circumstances require it. The key insight was that public perception of virtue could be more important than actual virtue for achieving beneficial outcomes. This analysis led me to formulate principles that directly contradicted traditional moral instruction. I argued that it is better for a leader to be feared than loved, because fear is more reliable than affection for maintaining order and achieving objectives. I suggested that promises should be kept only when keeping them serves the public interest, not out of abstract commitment to honesty. I demonstrated that successful leaders must be willing to act against faith, charity, humanity, and religion when these virtues conflict with effective governance. Throughout the writing process, I was acutely aware that I was challenging fundamental assumptions about the relationship between morality and politics. But my experiences had convinced me that these assumptions were not just wrong. They were dangerous because they prevented leaders from taking the actions necessary to serve their subjects' real interests. I structured the work as a practical manual rather than a philosophical treatise, providing specific guidance for common leadership challenges. I analyzed how to acquire and maintain power, how to deal with internal threats and external enemies, how to manage relationships with allies and subordinates, and how to adapt to changing circumstances. Every recommendation was based on historical evidence of what had actually worked, not on theoretical speculation about what ought to work. The underlying theme throughout the manuscript was that results matter more than intentions, and that effective leadership requires the wisdom to choose methods based on their likely outcomes rather than their moral appeal. I was not advocating immorality for its own sake, but rather arguing that the highest moral purpose, serving the common good sometimes, requires methods that appear immoral to those who judge by intentions rather than consequences. Writing The Prince forced me to articulate principles that I had discovered through painful experience but had never systematically examined. The process of explaining these ideas clarified my own thinking and revealed connections between different aspects of political reality that I had not previously understood. The manuscript became not just a guide for future leaders, but a comprehensive theory of how power actually operates in human affairs. One of my most important discoveries during this period of reflection was that effective leadership requires mastering two fundamentally different approaches to power: the way of the lion and the way of the fox. These ancient symbols, drawn from medieval bestiaries, represented the dual nature that every successful leader must possess the ability to use both force and cunning, depending on what circumstances demand. The lion represents the direct application of strength and authority. When leaders face challenges that can be overcome through superior resources, clear commands, and decisive action, they must be willing to employ force without hesitation or apology. This approach works when opponents respect strength, when objectives are clear, and when the costs of delay outweigh the costs of immediate action. I had witnessed the power of the lion approach in leaders like Cesare Borgia when he dealt with open rebellion or external military threats. In these situations, anything less than overwhelming force would have been interpreted as weakness and would have encouraged further challenges. The lion's approach serves not just the leader's interests, but often the broader public interest by resolving conflicts quickly and definitively, rather than allowing them to fester and spread. However, I had also learned that the lion's approach has severe limitations. Many challenges cannot be resolved through direct force because they involve opponents who are too strong to defeat. Situations where the costs of open conflict are prohibitive, or problems that require cooperation rather than submission. Leaders who rely exclusively on strength often find themselves trapped in conflicts they cannot win, or creating new enemies faster than they can defeat old ones. This is where the fox becomes essential. The fox represents cunning, adaptability, and the strategic use of deception when direct force is impossible or counterproductive. Successful leaders must be willing to achieve their objectives through indirect means: negotiation, manipulation, alliance building, and, when necessary, strategic deception. The fox approach requires patience, subtlety, and the ability to think several steps ahead of opponents. I observed this approach in the French court, where officials routinely achieved their objectives through complex diplomatic maneuvering rather than threats or ultimatums. They understood that some goals could only be reached by convincing others that cooperation served their own interests, even when the real benefits flowed primarily to France. This required the fox's ability to present situations from multiple angles and to structure agreements that appeared mutually beneficial while actually favoring one party. The most successful leaders I studied possessed both capabilities and knew when to employ each approach. They could be lions when strength was required and foxes when cunning was more appropriate. Most importantly, they could switch between approaches as circumstances changed, maintaining the flexibility necessary to adapt to new challenges without being constrained by previous methods. I realized that my own career failures had resulted partly from my inability to master both approaches. I had been trained in the arts of negotiation and persuasion, essentially fox-like skills, but I had never learned when these methods were insufficient and stronger measures were required. Conversely, when I attempted to use force through the militia project, I had done so clumsily, without understanding the practical requirements for successful application of strength. The combination of lion and fox approaches also requires a sophisticated understanding of when each method is likely to be effective. Direct force works best when opponents are weaker, when objectives are simple and concrete, and when the leader possesses overwhelming advantages. Cunning works better when opponents are equally strong, when objectives are complex or long-term, and when cooperation is necessary for sustainable success. Perhaps most importantly, I discovered that successful leaders often use the threat of the lion to make the fox approach more effective. When opponents know that a leader is capable of direct action, they are more likely to cooperate with indirect approaches. The fox's cleverness becomes more persuasive when backed by the lion's strength, even when that strength is never actually employed. This principle extends to how leaders manage their reputations and public personas. They must be known for possessing both capabilities, so that others cannot predict which approach will be used in any given situation. This unpredictability itself becomes a source of power, because opponents must prepare for multiple possible responses rather than developing strategies based on predictable behavior patterns. The lion and fox combination also applies to how leaders deal with different types of people and problems. Some subordinates respond better to clear authority and direct commands, while others perform better when they believe they are participating in decision-making processes. Some opponents can only be defeated through superior force, while others can be converted into allies through skilled negotiation. I learned that the greatest leaders in history had mastered this duality so completely that they could employ both approaches simultaneously in different aspects of the same situation. They might use force to establish credibility while using cunning to achieve their real objectives. Or they might negotiate publicly while preparing for conflict privately. During my years of exile and reflection, I grappled with one of the most fundamental questions in political leadership: how much of success depends on the leader's skill versus the circumstances they encounter. This led me to develop what I consider one of my most important insights: the dynamic relationship between what I call vertec and fortuna, between human capability and the ever-changing forces of circumstance. Fortune, I came to understand, is like a violent river that floods its banks unpredictably. When it rages, it sweeps away everything in its path. Trees, buildings, entire landscapes are transformed by forces that seem completely beyond human control. But when the waters are calm, wise people can build dikes, dig channels, and create structures that will direct the river's force when it floods again. The key insight is that fortune's power depends partly on our preparation during peaceful times. I had experienced this principle directly through the collapse of my own career. The return of the Medici was an example of political fortuna, sudden change in circumstances that swept away the entire republican structure I had served. But I also recognized that better preparation might have provided some protection. Leaders who had cultivated relationships with both sides, who had built personal networks independent of any single regime, who had accumulated resources and options. These people weathered the change more successfully. This analysis led me to understand that effective leadership requires a fundamentally different approach to planning and decision-making than I had previously employed. Instead of developing rigid strategies based on current conditions, successful leaders must build flexibility into everything they do. They must prepare for multiple possible futures rather than betting everything on their ability to predict which future will actually occur. I observed this principle in action. When studying how different leaders had responded to similar challenges, those who succeeded were not necessarily more intelligent or virtuous than those who failed, but they were more adaptable. When circumstances changed, they quickly adjusted their methods to fit new realities. They treated their previous strategies as tools to be discarded when they no longer served their purposes, rather than as sacred commitments that must be honored regardless of effectiveness. The relationship between skill and circumstance also taught me why rigid moral principles can be so dangerous in political leadership. A leader who is committed to always telling the truth may find that honesty destroys essential alliances during a crisis. A leader who is pledged never to use violence may discover that this commitment encourages enemies to attack when they would otherwise negotiate. Moral rigidity prevents the adaptation that changing circumstances require. I began to understand that what people call virtue in political leadership is actually the ability to read circumstances accurately and respond appropriately, regardless of whether that response conforms to abstract moral principles. A leader who uses harsh methods during a time of crisis but gentle methods during periods of stability is not being inconsistent. They are demonstrating the kind of practical wisdom that circumstances require. This insight revolutionized my understanding of historical examples I had studied. Leaders I had previously judged as inconsistent or opportunistic were actually demonstrating sophisticated adaptation to changing conditions. Their apparent contradictions were evidence of their skill at matching methods to circumstances rather than indications of moral weakness or strategic confusion. The fortune-virtue dynamic also explained why some leaders who had achieved great success during one period failed catastrophically when conditions changed. They had become identified with methods that worked in specific circumstances, and when those circumstances changed, they were unable or unwilling to develop new approaches. Their previous success became an obstacle to future adaptation. I realized that my own diplomatic career had suffered from this problem. I had developed an approach based on rational argument and moral appeal that worked reasonably well during stable periods, but I had never learned to recognize when circumstances required different methods. When the political environment became more volatile and dangerous, I continued using the same techniques that had previously brought modest success, even though they were completely inappropriate for the new situation. The most practical application of this principle is that leaders must constantly monitor their environment for signs of change that might require strategic adaptation. They cannot afford to become so attached to current methods that they miss signals indicating when those methods are becoming obsolete. This requires a kind of intellectual humility that acknowledges the temporary nature of any particular approach. Fortune also teaches us that timing is often more important than content in political action. The same proposal that fails completely when introduced at the wrong moment may succeed brilliantly when circumstances have changed. Effective leaders learn to read these rhythms and to coordinate their actions with favorable conditions rather than forcing action when the environment is hostile. One of the most sophisticated lessons I learned during my political education was the critical distinction between being virtuous and appearing virtuous. This insight emerged from observing how successful leaders managed public perception while maintaining the practical flexibility necessary for effective governance. Like actors on a stage, They had mastered the art of performing virtue while reserving the right to act according to circumstance rather than rigid principle. The theatre mask became my symbol for this essential leadership skill because it captured the dual nature that effective rulers must possess. They must convince their subjects, allies, and enemies that they are guided by consistent moral principles, while privately maintaining the flexibility to adapt their methods to whatever circumstances require. This is not simple is a sophisticated understanding of how public leadership actually functions. I discovered this principle through painful observation of leaders who had failed to master the performance of virtue. They might have been privately moral, but their inability to project the right image had undermined their effectiveness and ultimately harmed the people they were trying to serve. Conversely, leaders who understood how to manage perception could accomplish beneficial objectives that would have been impossible for more genuinely virtuous but less skilled performers. The key insight is that public perception of a leader's character directly affects their ability to achieve policy objectives. A leader who is believed to be just, merciful, and reliable will find that others are more willing to cooperate, make agreements, and accept difficult decisions. This cooperation enables the leader to accomplish more through persuasion than would be possible through force alone, ultimately serving the common good more effectively. However, I also learned that rigid adherence to virtue in all circumstances can prevent leaders from taking actions that serve the public interest. A leader who is genuinely incapable of deception may be unable to conduct effective diplomacy. A leader who cannot threaten credible retaliation may invite attacks that could have been prevented. A leader who refuses to act against individual interests may be unable to protect collective welfare. This creates the fundamental challenge of political leadership: how to maintain public credibility for virtue, while preserving private flexibility for effective action. The solution is to become skilled at the performance of virtue, to consistently project the image of moral reliability, while maintaining the practical capability to act according to circumstance when necessary. I observed this skill in successful diplomats who could appear completely honest and trustworthy, while conducting complex negotiations that required strategic concealment of information and tactical misdirection. Their counterparts trusted them because they projected sincerity and reliability. But this trust enabled them to achieve objectives that would have been impossible through completely transparent methods. The performance of virtue also extends to how leaders present their decisions to the public. Actions that serve long-term interests may appear harmful in the short term, and actions that are practically necessary may conflict with popular moral expectations. Skilled leaders learn to frame their decisions in ways that emphasize their virtuous motivations, while downplaying aspects that might be controversial. This requires understanding the difference between the substance of leadership and its presentation. The substance involves making effective decisions based on accurate assessment of circumstances and likely consequences. The presentation involves explaining those decisions in ways that maintain public support and confidence. Both skills are essential, and neither alone is sufficient for sustained success. I learned that the most effective approach is to genuinely embrace virtuous objectives while maintaining flexibility about methods. A leader who truly wants to serve the public interest, protect the weak, and promote prosperity can honestly project these commitments while reserving judgment about which specific actions will best serve these goals. This allows them to appear consistent in their values, while adapting their tactics to changing circumstances. The timing of when to reveal different aspects of one's character also becomes crucial. A leader may need to demonstrate mercy in some situations and firmness in others, generosity at certain moments and frugality at different times. The skill lies in understanding which virtues to emphasize when, and how to transition between different presentations without appearing inconsistent or unreliable. Perhaps, most importantly, I discovered that the performance of virtue must be grounded in genuine commitment to beneficial outcomes. Leaders who attempt to manipulate perception purely for personal advantage eventually lose credibility because their actions consistently contradict their stated principles. But leaders who use impression management in service of legitimate objectives can maintain public trust while achieving results that pure virtue might make impossible. Perhaps no aspect of my political philosophy has been more misunderstood than my analysis of whether it is better for a leader to be feared or loved. This question arose from my systematic study of what motivates people to follow orders, honor agreements, and maintain loyalty during difficult periods. The answer I reached, that fear is more reliable than love, was based on careful observation of human behavior under pressure, not on any preference for cruelty over kindness. The question itself emerged from watching how different types of authorities survived various crises. I observed leaders who were genuinely beloved by their subjects, and others who were feared but respected. When external pressures mounted and difficult decisions became necessary, patterns emerged that challenged my previous assumptions about the sources of political stability. Love, I discovered, is a wonderful thing when it exists, but it suffers from fundamental weaknesses as a foundation for political authority. It is voluntary, temporary, and largely beyond the leader's direct control. People love leaders who make them feel good, who give them what they want, and who confirm their existing beliefs and preferences. But love evaporates quickly when leaders must make unpopular decisions, impose necessary sacrifices, or act against immediate popular desires for long-term benefits. I witnessed this principle repeatedly during my diplomatic career. Leaders who were adored during prosperous times found themselves abandoned when circumstances required harsh measures. Their subjects' love had been conditional on continued comfort and satisfaction, and when those conditions changed, the love disappeared. Worse, the disappointed love often transformed into bitter resentment that made these leaders more vulnerable than if they had never been loved at all. Fear, by contrast, is more reliable because it is based on consistent consequences rather than fluctuating emotions. When people fear a leader, they understand that certain actions will result in predictable penalties. This creates a stable framework for behavior that persists, regardless of changing circumstances or popular moods. Fear provides the kind of dependable motivation that leaders need to implement policies and maintain order during crisis periods. The key insight is that fear, properly managed, is more respectful of human nature than attempts to maintain artificial love. It acknowledges that people are primarily motivated by self-interest and responds to this reality rather than trying to reform it. A system based on fear assumes that people will act badly if given the opportunity and create structures that make bad behavior costly. This actually protects both the leader and the lead by establishing clear boundaries and consistent expectations. However, I must emphasize that effective fear is very different from random cruelty or arbitrary violence. The goal is not to terrorize people into submission, but to create reliable consequences that guide behavior toward beneficial outcomes. Effective fear is predictable, proportionate, and directly connected to actions that harm the common good. It resembles the authority of law rather than the chaos of tyranny. The most successful leaders I studied had learned to inspire a very specific type of fear, the fear of disappointing someone they respected. Their subjects feared losing the leader's approval, feared being excluded from the community of reliable people, feared the consequences of failing to meet clearly defined expectations. This type of fear actually enhances human dignity by assuming that people are capable of meeting high standards when those standards are consistently enforced. I also learned that the choice between fear and love is often false. because the most effective leaders inspire both emotions simultaneously. Their subjects love them for their competence, their protection, and their commitment to justice. But they also fear the consequences of betraying that trust. This combination creates the strongest possible foundation for political authority, because it appeals to both positive and negative motivations. The practical application of this principle requires understanding when to emphasize each approach. During stable periods, leaders can afford to rely more heavily on positive motivations like gratitude, loyalty, and shared values. During crisis periods, they must be willing to emphasize consequences and penalties to maintain order and implement necessary but unpopular measures. The timing of when to inspire fear is also crucial. It should be done early in a leader's tenure, when establishing credibility and setting expectations, rather than later when it may appear desperate or reactive. People need to understand from the beginning that the leader is capable of enforcing their decisions, even if that capability is rarely exercised. Most importantly, I learned that both fear and love must be grounded in respect for the leader's competence and commitment to beneficial outcomes. People will tolerate being feared by someone they believe is working for their long-term interests, and they will love someone whose strength protects them from external threats and internal chaos. The most challenging aspect of my political education involved understanding when harsh methods serve merciful purposes and when apparent mercy actually constitutes cruelty. This paradox became clear through studying leaders who had achieved humanitarian outcomes through methods that appeared inhumane to observers focused on intentions rather than results. Like a surgeon's knife that causes immediate pain to prevent greater suffering, decisive harshness can sometimes serve more compassionate purposes than gentle approaches that allow problems to worsen. My analysis began with examining cases where leaders had failed to act decisively against emerging threats, hoping that patience and clemency would resolve problems naturally. Time and again, I observed how this merciful approach led to far greater suffering than early intervention would have caused. Small rebellions that could have been crushed quickly were allowed to grow into devastating civil wars. Corrupt officials who could have been removed immediately were permitted to steal increasingly large sums before their eventual downfall. In each case, the leader's desire to avoid harsh measures resulted in exponentially greater harm. I witnessed this principle most clearly in Cesare Borgia's handling of civil disorder in the Romagna region. When he inherited control of these territories, they were plagued by constant violence between competing factions. Previous rulers had attempted to restore order through negotiation, compromise, and appeals to the better nature of the combatants. These merciful approaches had failed completely, leaving ordinary citizens trapped in a nightmare of endless warfare. Caesar's solution was swift and brutal. He identified the leaders who were perpetuating the violence and eliminated them decisively. He made examples of those who continued fighting that were so severe no one else dared to challenge his authority. Within months, a region that had suffered decades of bloodshed was peaceful and prosperous. His apparent cruelty had accomplished what years of mercy could not achieve. The timing of harsh measures proves crucial to their effectiveness and moral justification. Decisive action taken early, when problems are still manageable, requires relatively modest force and affects relatively few people. The same problems allowed to develop eventually require massive intervention that affects far more people, far more severely. Early harshness prevents later catastrophe, while early mercy often necessitates later cruelty on a much larger scale. I learned to distinguish between two fundamentally different types of harmful action: cruelty that serves no purpose beyond the satisfaction of the person inflicting it, and severity that serves essential objectives, despite the personal cost to the leader who must authorize it. The first type is always wrong, because it causes suffering without corresponding benefit. The second type may be morally required if it prevents greater suffering or achieves crucial objectives that serve the common good. This distinction becomes clearer when examining the psychological burden that effective leaders must bear. Those who use harsh methods for selfish purposes typically enjoy the exercise of power over others. Those who use harsh methods for beneficial purposes typically find them emotionally difficult and personally costly. The reluctance to cause suffering, combined with the wisdom to do so when necessary, marks the difference between tyranny and effective governance. The speed and completeness of harsh measures also affects their moral character. Prolonged cruelty that extends suffering over long periods is generally more harmful than quick, decisive action that resolves problems permanently. Partial measures that inflict pain without solving underlying problems are worse than either complete mercy or complete severity. The worst approach is often the middle ground that combines the disadvantages of both approaches without the benefits of either. I observed that successful leaders develop the emotional discipline to act against their personal preferences when circumstances require it. They may naturally prefer gentle methods, but they force themselves to use harsh ones when effectiveness demands it. This self-mastery enables them to choose methods based on likely outcomes rather than personal comfort, serving their subjects' interests rather than their own psychological needs. The communication of harsh measures also influences their moral impact. When leaders explain the necessity behind difficult decisions and demonstrate that they take no personal pleasure in causing suffering, they maintain moral authority even while employing severe methods. When they present harsh actions as regrettable necessities rather than desired outcomes, they preserve the possibility of returning to gentler approaches once circumstances permit. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that the greatest cruelty is often the failure to act decisively when action is required. Leaders who allow preventable disasters to occur through excessive concern for their own moral purity are responsible for the resulting suffering, regardless of their good intentions. The surgeon who refuses to amputate a diseased limb may feel merciful, but the patient who dies from the spreading infection receives no benefit from that mercy. Looking back across the wreckage of my early career, I can now see that my failures were not random misfortunes but the inevitable consequences of a fundamentally flawed approach to leadership and governance. Like a phoenix rising from ashes, my understanding of effective leadership was reborn from the complete destruction of my previous worldview. This transformation was painful but necessary, and it taught me that sometimes our greatest disasters become our most valuable teachers. The first step in my personal evolution was accepting full responsibility for my failures rather than blaming external circumstances or the moral deficiencies of others. My diplomatic ineffectiveness had not resulted from dealing with uniquely dishonest counterparts. It had resulted from my naive assumption that moral arguments would influence people who were motivated by practical considerations. My militia disaster had not been caused by facing unusually professional opponents. It had been caused by my idealistic belief that motivation could substitute for competence. This acceptance of responsibility was psychologically difficult because it required abandoning the comfortable narrative that I had been a virtuous victim of an immoral world. I had to confront the possibility that my virtue had actually been a form of arrogance, refusal to engage with reality as it actually existed, rather than as I wished it to be. My high moral standards had made me feel superior to more pragmatic colleagues, but they had also made me less effective at serving the people I claimed to represent. The deeper lesson was recognizing how my good intentions had consistently blinded me to practical requirements for success. I had been so focused on maintaining my moral purity that I had failed to develop the skills necessary to achieve beneficial outcomes. My concern with appearing virtuous had prevented me from learning how to be effective, with the result that my virtue served no one's interests except my own psychological comfort. I began to understand that my transformation from idealist to realist was not a moral decline, but a moral evolution. My new approach did not abandon ethical considerations, subordinated process ethics to outcome ethics. Instead of asking whether a particular action conformed to abstract moral principles, I learned to ask whether it would produce beneficial results for the people affected by my decisions. This shift in perspective revealed patterns in my past behavior that I had not previously recognized. My diplomatic failures had occurred because I had prioritized feeling righteous over achieving favorable terms for Florence. My militia experiment had failed because I'd been more concerned with the moral purity of citizen soldiers than with their practical effectiveness in protecting civilians. In each case, my focus on good intentions had prevented me from focusing on good results. The personal cost of this transformation was substantial. I had to abandon beliefs that had provided meaning and structure to my entire adult life. I had to accept that many of my heroes from classical literature had been poor guides for real-world leadership. I had to acknowledge that my parents' moral instruction, however well-intentioned, had prepared me inadequately for the practical challenges of governance. But the benefits of this new understanding were immediate and profound. Once I stopped judging political actions by their moral appearance and started evaluating them by their practical consequences, I could finally understand why certain leaders succeeded while others failed. Patterns that had been invisible before became obvious. Strategies that had seemed mysterious revealed their underlying logic. I learned to distinguish between feeling effective and being effectiver, distinction that had eluded me throughout my government career. Many of my previous actions had made me feel virtuous and principled, but they had accomplished little of practical value. Conversely, actions that initially seemed morally questionable often produced genuinely beneficial outcomes for everyone involved. This new framework also helped me understand my own psychological motivations more clearly. I recognized that my attachment to moral purity had served my ego as much as any ethical principle. Being known as an honest, principled person had been personally satisfying, but it had also been a form of vanity that interfered with effective decision-making. The most liberating aspect of this transformation was the freedom it provided from impossible standards. I no longer needed to find morally perfect solutions to complex problems. I could focus on finding solutions that worked. I no longer needed to maintain consistency with past positions when circumstances had changed. I could adapt my methods to current realities. I no longer needed to appear virtuous to observers who judged by intentions. I could concentrate on achieving results that served real human needs. This personal evolution enabled me to write with clarity and honesty about political reality because I was no longer invested in maintaining illusions about how leadership actually operates. I could examine successful and unsuccessful leaders with equal objectivity because I had abandoned the need to find moral heroes and villains in complex historical situations. The principles I discovered through painful experience in Renaissance Italy apply with remarkable precision to leadership challenges in your modern world. While the specific contexts have changed boardrooms instead of palaces, corporate politics instead of city-state diplomacy, the fundamental dynamics of human nature and organizational power remain constant. The same patterns that determined success or failure 5 centuries ago continue to operate today, often with identical results in your contemporary business environment. I observe leaders making the same mistakes that destroyed my early career. They approach negotiations with excessive honesty, believing that transparency and good faith will be reciprocated by counterparts who are focused solely on achieving favorable outcomes. They make strategic decisions based on how those decisions will appear to observers rather than on their likely effectiveness. They prioritize maintaining positive relationships over achieving essential objectives, with the result that they accomplish neither. The modern equivalent of my diplomatic failures occurs daily in corporate settings. where well-intentioned leaders assume that rational arguments and appeals to fairness will persuade colleagues who are motivated by departmental interests, personal advancement, or competitive pressures. These leaders prepare detailed presentations about why their proposals serve the organization's overall interests, then watch in frustration as their recommendations are ignored in favor of options that better serve powerful constituencies. I see contemporary versions of my militia disaster in leaders who attempt to build organizational capabilities based on enthusiasm and commitment rather than competence and systematic preparation. They launch initiatives with great fanfare, emphasizing the noble purposes and moral imperatives behind their efforts, but fail to develop the practical skills and structural support necessary for success. When these initiatives fail, they blame insufficient commitment or organizational politics rather than recognizing their own inadequate preparation. The solution in your era, as in mine, requires focusing on results rather than intentions, while maintaining the appearance of virtue that enables sustained influence. Modern leaders must learn to separate their private decision-making process from their public presentation, choosing strategies based on effectiveness while explaining those strategies in terms that emphasize beneficial motivations and outcomes. This approach begins with systematic analysis of what actually motivates the people whose cooperation is necessary for success, instead of assuming that others share your commitment to abstract principles. Effective modern leaders invest time in understanding the specific interests, pressures, and constraints that drive their colleagues' behavior. They structure proposals and communications to address these real motivations, rather than appealing to idealized versions of how people ought to behave. The lion and fox principles apply directly to contemporary leadership challenges. Some situations require direct assertion of authority and clear consequences for non-compliance, the lion approach. Others require indirect influence, strategic compromise, and careful coalition building, the fox approach. The most successful modern leaders master both capabilities and choose between them based on circumstances rather than personal preferences or moral abstractions. Timing remains as crucial in your world as it was in mine. The same proposal that fails completely when introduced during organizational upheaval may succeed brilliantly when circumstances have stabilized. Modern leaders must learn to read environmental conditions and coordinate their actions with favorable moments rather than forcing initiatives when resistance is predictable. The performance of virtue has become even more important in your media-saturated environment, where every action is subject to public scrutiny and interpretation. Modern leaders must become skilled at framing their decisions in ways that emphasize virtuous motivations while maintaining operational flexibility. They must learn to appear consistent in their values while adapting their methods to changing circumstances. The fear versus love dynamic operates powerfully in contemporary organizations. Leaders who rely exclusively on being liked often find themselves unable to implement necessary but unpopular changes. Those who understand how to inspire productive fear of missing opportunities, fear of falling behind competitors, fear of disappointing trusted colleagues, can achieve results that pure popularity cannot produce. Perhaps most importantly, modern leaders must develop the same intellectual honesty that transformed my understanding after my career collapsed. They must be willing to abandon comfortable assumptions about how organizations should work in favor of accurate assessment of how they actually work. They must prioritize effectiveness over appearance, results over process, and beneficial outcomes over moral posturing. The greatest opportunity in your era lies in applying these time-tested principles while avoiding the specific mistakes that limited their application in previous generations. Modern leaders have access to information, communication tools, and analytical methods that enable more sophisticated implementation of results-focused strategies. They can be more effective than any previous generation of leaders if they combine practical wisdom about human nature with contemporary capabilities for coordination and execution. As I conclude this examination of my life's most important lessons, I want to leave you with the practical wisdom that can transform your approach to leadership and achievement. The compass rose that points true north represents the clarity of the direction that comes from focusing on results rather than intentions, from measuring success by outcomes rather than efforts, from building effectiveness rather than merely appearing virtuous. The fundamental truth I discovered through decades of failure and reflection is this: the world does not reward good intentions, rewards good results. The people you lead, the organizations you serve, and the communities you impact will benefit from your effectiveness, not from your purity of motive. Your legacy will be determined by what you actually accomplish, not by how virtuous you appeared while attempting to accomplish it. This does not mean abandoning ethical considerations, but rather recognizing that the highest ethical standard is achieving beneficial outcomes for those who depend on your leadership. Sometimes this requires methods that make you uncomfortable. Sometimes it demands actions that seem to contradict your stated principles. Sometimes it necessitates bearing the moral burden of decisions that serve long-term interests at short-term costs. The path forward begins with honest assessment of your current approach to leadership challenges. Ask yourself whether you are choosing strategies based on their likely effectiveness or their moral appearance. Examine whether your decision-making process prioritizes beneficial outcomes or personal comfort. Consider whether your commitment to consistency prevents you from adapting to changing circumstances. Develop the dual capabilities of the lion and the fox. Learn when to use direct authority and when to employ indirect influence. Master the art of appearing virtuous while maintaining operational flexibility. Build relationships based on mutual benefit rather than sentimental appeals. Create systems that reward desired behavior rather than simply announcing desired values. Most importantly, measure your success by the results you achieve rather than the methods you employ. Track whether your leadership actually improves the lives of those you serve. Monitor whether your decisions produce the outcomes you intended. Evaluate whether your approach creates lasting positive change or merely temporary satisfaction for various stakeholders. The compass of results-focused leadership will guide you through the inevitable storms and uncertainties that every leader faces. When you are tempted to choose comfortable ineffectiveness over uncomfortable success, remember that those who depend on your leadership deserve your best efforts, not your most virtuous intentions. When you must choose between appearing good and doing good, choose the path that serves real human needs rather than abstract moral principles. Your generation has the opportunity to combine the practical wisdom of effective leadership with the tools and knowledge that previous generations lacked. You can be more successful than any leaders in history if you are willing to learn from their mistakes and build upon their discoveries. But this opportunity requires the intellectual courage to see reality clearly and the moral courage to act. On that understanding, the legacy you create will be measured not by the purity of your intentions, but by the magnitude of your positive impact. The people whose lives you improve will remember your effectiveness, not your virtue. The problems you solve will matter more than the methods you used to solve them. The beneficial changes you implement will outlast any temporary criticism of your approach. I challenge you to embrace this results-oriented philosophy, not as an abandonment of moral leadership, but as its highest expression. True moral leadership serves the real needs of real people through whatever means prove most effective. It judges success by beneficial outcomes rather than virtuous processes. It builds lasting positive change rather than temporary moral satisfaction. Take the compass of practical wisdom that I offer you, learned through my failures and refined through years of reflection. Use it to navigate toward objectives that matter, employing methods that work, creating results that last. Let your legacy be written in the lives you improve, the problems you solve, and the positive changes you make possible through effective leadership focused on results rather than intentions.